Have you ever knelt down to pray and felt nothing answer back? Your words rise, but the heavens feel sealed. Your heart reaches, but God feels distant, silent, unreachable. You still believe, you still show up, you still whisper his name in the dark. Yet something feels missing. And the most painful part isn't the silence itself, it's the fear that follows it. What if everyone else feels him, and I don't? What if my faith is broken? What if God has stepped away from me? There are people listening right now who worship faithfully, read scripture, attend church, and serve others, yet deep inside they feel numb toward God. No warmth, no closeness, no sense of his presence, only a quiet, aching gap where connection used to be. And because no one talks about it openly, that gap turns into shame. You start blaming yourself. You start wondering what you did wrong. You start comparing your private emptiness to other people's public faith. But what if that gap is not proof of distance, but evidence of something deeper happening beneath the surface? What if the silence isn't rejection, but transition? What if God is closer than you think, just working in a way you weren't taught to recognize? Throughout Scripture, some of the most faithful people walked through seasons where God felt absent. David cried out and heard nothing. Job prayed into silence. Even Jesus stood beneath an unresponsive sky and asked why he felt forsaken. So if you feel disconnected, numb, or unable to sense God's presence right now, this message is not here to accuse you. It's here to reveal something hidden. Because the unexplained gaps, those spaces where feeling disappears, may actually be where faith is being rebuilt at a deeper level than emotion ever could. And before this message is over, you may realize that your inability to feel God does not mean you've lost him. It may mean he's preparing you to know him in a way you never have before. There is a truth many believers are never told. And because it remains unspoken, countless people silently suffer under its weight. We were taught that faith always feels like fire, that God's presence always arrives with warmth, tears, goosebumps, or overwhelming emotion. And when those sensations disappear, we assume something is wrong with us. But Scripture never promised that God would always be felt. It promised that he would always be faithful. The unexplained gap, the season where God feels distant, is not an accident. It is not a punishment, and it is not proof that your prayers are falling on deaf ears. Often, it is the moment God is shifting the way he relates to you. Think about this. Children learn through touch, reassurance, and constant feedback. But maturity requires something different. At some point, the support doesn't disappear, it transforms. And many people confuse transformation with abandonment. God does the same with his children. There are seasons where his presence feels obvious, emotional, and tangible. And then there are seasons where he withdraws those feelings, not his love, not his attention, but the sensations. So faith can move from dependence on emotion to dependence on truth. This is why so many sincere believers feel lost. No one prepared them for the silence. No one told them that God sometimes teaches us how to walk without holding our hand. And in those quiet stretches, doubt creeps in. You pray harder, you worship louder, you search for the feeling you once had. But the harder you chase it, the further it seems to go. That is where many people give up. Not because they stopped believing in God, but because they believed God stopped believing in them. If you are in that place right now, you are not alone, and you are not failing. You are standing at a threshold few understand. This is why we created the devotional When God is Silent, linked in the pinned comment. It was written for believers who love God deeply, yet feel disconnected from his presence. Not to force emotion, but to teach discernment. Not to manufacture feelings, but to recognize how God speaks when he is quiet. Many have found that it helped them reconnect with God in ways that went beyond sensation and into something more enduring. Because silence does not mean absence, and the gap you feel may not be empty at all. It may be full of growth you cannot yet see. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something important. If this message resonates even a little, don't just listen passively. As an act of faith, take a moment and like this video, not for an algorithm, but as a quiet declaration that you are still seeking God even in silence. And in the comments write, "I still trust Him." Not because you feel it perfectly, but because you choose it intentionally. If you know someone who has grown quiet in their faith, someone who still believes but feels disconnected, share this message with them. Sometimes God uses another voice to say what our hearts are afraid to admit. Now let me take you into a story, one that reveals why these gaps exist and what God is actually doing inside them. There was a man who walked closer to Jesus than almost anyone else. He leaned against his chest. He heard his heartbeat. He watched miracles happen from arm's length away. His name was John. John wasn't a distant follower. He wasn't on the edge of the crowd. He was part of the inner circle. When Jesus spoke privately, John was there. When Jesus withdrew to pray, John followed. When others doubted, John stayed. He saw the blind see. He watched the dead rise. He witnessed water turn into wine and bread multiply in empty hands. John knew what it felt like to be close to God, viscerally, tangibly, undeniably. And then everything fell apart. Jesus was arrested, beaten, mocked, crucified. The voice John trusted went silent. The hands that healed were pierced. The presence that once filled every room disappeared into a tomb. John stood at the foot of the cross while heaven said nothing. Imagine the confusion. Imagine the disorientation. This wasn't just grief, it was theological collapse. Everything John believed about God's nearness was suddenly contradicted by reality. And yet, John stayed faithful. After the resurrection, John helped lead the early church. He preached, he taught, he encouraged believers, he carried the message of Christ into a hostile world. But over time, persecution intensified. One by one, the apostles were killed. Eventually, John was arrested, not for a crime, not for violence, but for refusing to stop speaking about Jesus. They didn't execute him, they exiled him. John was sent to Patmos, a barren, rocky island used as a prison colony. No churches, no community, no fellowship, just isolation, heat, hard labor, and silence. This was the man who once leaned on Jesus' chest. Now he lay alone on stone. Years passed. And here is where many people misunderstand John's story. We imagine Patmos as a place of constant visions and divine encounters. But Scripture tells us something subtle and profound. John says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day," which implies something important. It implies that before that moment, there were many days when he wasn't. John didn't live in non-stop revelation. He lived in routine obedience, long stretches of silence, faith without affirmation, belief without reinforcement. Think about that. The disciple closest to Jesus endured a season where God felt absent enough that the breakthrough moment had to be specified. And it was there, in exile, in isolation, in silence, that God finally spoke again. Not as a gentle whisper this time, but as a thunderous revelation. The book of Revelation was not written in a revival environment. It was written in a gap. John did not receive his greatest revelation in comfort. He received it after endurance. And notice this, God did not speak to John until he stopped chasing the old form of closeness. There were no crowds, no miracles, no physical Jesus to lean against, only faith refined by time and silence. Patmos was not punishment, it was preparation. God was not distant, he was deliberate. The gap John lived in stripped away everything external until all that remained was truth. And when God finally spoke, John didn't just hear encouragement, he received vision, perspective, eternal clarity. He saw Christ not as the suffering servant, but as the reigning king. What John lost in feeling, he gained in revelation. And this is the part that speaks directly to you. If God feels distant right now, it may be because he is no longer revealing himself in the ways he used to, not because those ways were wrong, but because they are no longer sufficient for where he is taking you. John's silence was not abandonment, it was advancement. And the same God who met John on Patmos is working in the quiet places of your life, forming something deeper than emotion could ever sustain. There is a reason the silence feels so unsettling, and it is not because something has gone wrong with your faith. It is because silence confronts the part of us that learned to rely on feedback to survive. From a psychological perspective, human beings are wired to associate connection with responsiveness. When someone we love stops responding the way they used to, our nervous system interprets it as danger, rejection, or loss. So when God feels quiet, your mind doesn't remain neutral. It starts searching for explanations, and most of the time it turns inward. You assume the problem is you, but Scripture repeatedly challenges that assumption. In Hebrews, we are told that we walk by faith, not by sight. Yet for many believers, faith has quietly become synonymous with feeling. When the feelings disappear, they assume faith has disappeared too. But biblically speaking, faith was never defined by emotional confirmation. Faith is trust anchored in truth, even when perception contradicts it. Look at the Psalms. David, a man described as being after God's own heart, regularly confessed that God felt far away. He asked why God was silent. He questioned why God seemed hidden. Yet never once did God accuse David of weak faith for asking those questions. In fact, those prayers are preserved as Scripture itself. This tells us something critical. Feeling distant from God is not the same as being distant from God. Psychologically, there is a phenomenon called attachment maturation. Early attachment relies heavily on reassurance and proximity. Mature attachment, however, is marked by security even in absence. The relationship doesn't dissolve just because the other party isn't immediately perceptible. God often leads his children through this same process. Early in your faith, God may have allowed you to feel him strongly because you needed that closeness to believe. But over time, he invites you into a deeper form of relationship, one that isn't destabilized by silence. This is why Jesus said, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." He wasn't praising blindness, he was affirming maturity. Silence forces something powerful to surface, what your faith is actually built on. If your faith collapses without feeling, then feeling was the foundation. But if your faith endures, even when God feels unreachable, then truth has begun to take root. Scripture also reveals that God sometimes withholds emotional reassurance to refine motive. When we don't feel him, we're confronted with a question we often avoid. Do we seek God for who he is or for how he makes us feel? That question is uncomfortable, but it is transformative. Even Jesus experienced this tension. In Gethsemane, he did not feel comfort. He felt anguish. On the cross, he quoted Psalm 22, not because he had lost faith, but because he was fully experiencing what it meant to trust God without felt closeness. And here is what psychology confirms that Scripture has shown for centuries. Growth often happens in emotional discomfort. Neural pathways are strengthened not when everything is easy, but when we persist through uncertainty without abandoning what we know to be true. Your silence is not empty space, it is resistance training for faith. God is not trying to make you doubt him, he is training you to trust him without crutches. And once that trust is formed, something remarkable happens. Your faith becomes resilient, no longer dependent on mood, atmosphere, or circumstance, no longer shaken every time emotion fluctuates. This is why some believers seem unshakable, not because they always feel God, but because they learned to walk with him when they didn't. And if you are in that season now, you are not behind. You are being strengthened in ways you cannot yet measure. If you feel like you are walking through a spiritual fog right now, hear this clearly. The fog does not mean you are lost. It means your senses are being retrained. God is teaching your spirit how to discern Him without relying on emotional visibility. There are people listening to this who have been quietly asking, "What changed in me?" But heaven is asking a different question. What has grown in you? You have not drifted from God. You have been led deeper than feeling can follow. The silence you are in is not empty. It is intentional. God is stripping away dependency on signs, sensations, and reassurance so that your faith can stand on something unmovable. What feels like distance is actually refinement. Some of you have been grieving the version of faith you used to have, the one that felt alive every day, the one that overflowed easily. But God is not taking life from you. He is building roots beneath the surface. Roots do not grow in the spotlight. They grow in the dark. And here is what the Spirit wants you to know. This season will not last forever. Silence is not God's final word. But when God speaks again, you will hear Him with greater clarity, greater discernment, and greater authority than before. You will no longer confuse emotion with truth. You will no longer mistake excitement for intimacy. You will know God, not just feel Him. What you are becoming in this gap will outlast what you lost. Some of you are closer to breakthrough than you realize, not because you feel stronger, but because your faith has survived without reinforcement. That kind of faith moves heaven. You are not being ignored. You are being entrusted. God does not place weight on weak foundations, and He would not allow you to walk through this season if He had not already determined that you could carry what comes next. So don't quit in the quiet. Don't interpret silence as separation. Don't walk away because the feeling hasn't returned yet. God is still with you, still shaping you, still walking beside you, even now. And when the gap closes, you will realize something profound. He never left. He was just teaching you how to walk by faith and not by sight. If you are still here, thank you, not just for listening, but for staying. There is something deeply significant about endurance. Many people click away when the message touches something tender, but you stayed. And that tells me something about your heart. You are still seeking God, even when the path feels unclear. If this message spoke to where you are right now, I want you to mark this moment intentionally. In the comments, write, "I will not quit in the silence." Let that be your declaration, not because everything makes sense, but because your faith is choosing to stand. If this video helped put words to something you've been carrying alone, take a moment to like it, not for visibility, but as a quiet act of agreement with what God is doing in you. And if someone you love has been drifting, not away from God, but through silence, share this with them. Sometimes the greatest ministry is simply letting someone know they are not broken. If you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing so. Walking with God is not about constant noise. It's about faithful steps taken day after day. And this space exists to walk those steps together, especially in seasons that feel confusing or quiet. You'll also notice you can hype this video. If this message deserves to be lifted so it reaches someone who feels unseen, use that feature as a way of amplifying hope. For those who want to go deeper, becoming a channel member helps sustain this ministry and gives you access to deeper teachings created specifically for those walking through complex seasons of faith. And if this message truly ministered to you, super thanks is another way to help keep these messages going to people who desperately need them. And remember, if you are struggling with God's silence, the devotional When God is Silent is linked in the pinned comment. It was created for moments exactly like this, to help you recognize God's presence when feelings fade and answers delay. Thank you for allowing this message into your quiet place. Thank you for trusting this space with something sacred. No matter where you are on the journey, no matter how silent it feels right now, keep walking with God.